There are moments when a life changes so quietly that no one notices it at first. No thunder announces it. No angel steps down from the sky. It begins with something small, almost ordinary. A door left unlocked. A bowl of hot food shared between strangers. A tired woman deciding not to walk past two old people shivering in the rain. Naledi Dlamini did not know that the choice she made that night would redraw the rest of her life. She only knew that she was 29 years old, 7 months pregnant, widowed too young, and standing in the cold with a heart that had already lost more than it could explain. When she saw the old couple huddled beneath the rusted shutter of a closed pharmacy, soaked to the skin and shaking under a threadbare blanket, she did not think about danger. She did not think about consequences. She simply thought, they cannot stay here tonight. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. That evening had begun the way most of Naledi's evenings began now, with numbers that refused to become mercy. She sat at the small table in her 5th-floor apartment on the south side of Johannesburg, counting crumpled rand notes beneath a weak yellow bulb. 1,480 rand. She counted again. The amount did not change. Rent was due in 4 days. Her next prenatal visit would cost almost half of what she had left. The landlord had already warned her that sympathy did not pay mortgages. The clinic had already warned her that stress was bad for the baby. As if stress were some expensive luxury she had chosen for herself. Her apartment was barely more than 1 room and a narrow kitchenette. Damp had crept down one wall in dark veins. The tap leaked with slow, patient cruelty, 1 drop at a time, day and night. The mattress on her bed dipped in the middle. The window faced a narrow alley where sunlight rarely entered. But it was hers, or at least it would remain hers if she somehow found a way to survive 1 more month. She stood, one hand pressed at the small of her back, the other resting over the curve of her stomach. The baby shifted beneath her palm, a gentle kick, then stillness. Naledi closed her eyes. "I know," she whispered. "I'm trying." 3 months earlier, her husband Temba had kissed her forehead before leaving for a construction site in Sandton. He had promised to bring oranges on the way home because she had been craving them all week. He never came back. A crane cable snapped. Metal fell. Men shouted. By the time Naledi reached the hospital, the doctors were already speaking to her in those careful voices that always mean there is no hope left to discuss. Temba died before dawn. She remembered his work boots beside the bed for weeks afterward. She remembered reaching for him in her sleep. She remembered the silence that followed. Temba had been the first person who ever made Naledi feel chosen. She had grown up moving through foster homes, church shelters, and relatives who kept her only until keeping her became inconvenient. She learned early how to fold herself small, how to eat little, how to ask for less. She had once dreamed of becoming a nurse. She even completed her first year of training before fees pushed her out. Life had trained her to expect closed doors, but Temba had been an open one. He laughed with his whole chest. He fixed broken things with patient hands. He called her my brave girl, even on the days she did not feel brave at all. Now he was gone, and the world had quickly gone back to asking what use she was without a man beside her. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message. She looked down and felt her stomach turn before she even opened it. It was from Sibusiso, Temba's older brother. "You still owe for the funeral. Don't act like pregnancy makes you special." Naledi stared at the words, then deleted them. She did not have the strength for rage. Rage required energy. Energy required food and sleep, and she had not had enough of either in weeks. At 6:30, she left for work. She buttoned her loose coat over her swollen belly, locked the apartment, and began the descent down 5 flights of concrete stairs because the building lift had been dead for 2 years. By 7:30, she was in the marble lobby of Muthlabeni Towers, a glittering office building where people in expensive shoes stepped around cleaners without ever quite seeing them. Naledi worked the night shift for a cleaning contractor. She emptied bins, mopped corridors, wiped fingerprints from glass doors, and polished boardroom tables where million-rand deals were made by people who would never know her name. She moved quietly. She listened to other people's laughter echoing down corridors after meetings. She watched office lights go out one by one until the whole building seemed to belong only to those who cleaned it. That night, near the end of her shift, she heard raised voices in one of the executive hallways. A supervisor was shouting at an older cleaner named Madube, accusing her of missing a wastebasket in a meeting room. The old woman stood with her shoulders bent, apologizing again and again. Naledi saw the humiliation in her eyes before she felt the anger in her own chest. "She's been working since before sunset," Naledi said, stepping between them. "Talk to her with respect." The supervisor turned on her. "Do your job and mind your business." Naledi did not move. "Respect is my business." The man muttered something ugly under his breath and walked away because it is harder to bully someone when there is a witness who refuses to lower her eyes. Madube held Naledi's hand for a moment afterward, squeezing it with silent gratitude. Naledi thought nothing more of it. She had no way of knowing that a camera in the corner had recorded everything, or that far above the city, a man named Tariq Okoye would watch that footage more than once. When Naledi finally clocked out, the rain had already started. Not a soft rain, a hard Johannesburg rain that slapped against pavements and turned the road into shining black ribbon. She kept her head down, one arm over her belly, the other gripping her bag, and hurried through the wet streets toward her building. Then she saw them. The old man and woman were pressed together beneath the awning of a locked pharmacy, trying and failing to shield themselves from the wind. Their clothes clung to their thin bodies. The old woman's headscarf was half soaked through. The man had a cheap plastic travel bag at his feet, the kind sold at taxi ranks. It sagged with the weary shape of everything a person still owns. Their shoes were muddy. The woman's ankles were swollen. The man's hands trembled, not with fear, but with exhaustion so deep it had become part of his bones. Naledi slowed. Most people would have walked on. She knew that because she had seen 3 people already pass them without stopping. The city teaches you to harden yourself if you want to survive it. Look away. Don't ask. Don't invite trouble. But Naledi had lived too long as a person others looked past. She could not do it now. "Baba," she said gently, stepping closer. "Mama, where are you going in weather like this?" The old woman lifted her eyes. They were red-rimmed and full of a shame that did not belong to her. "Nowhere, child," she said. "We were told to wait for a bus. The bus never came." The old man said nothing. He only stood straighter, as if pride were the last dry thing he had left. Naledi looked at the bag, at the blanket, at the way the woman's lips shook from cold. She did not ask the question already forming in her mind. Who leaves old people at a bus stop and never returns? Some wounds do not need to be touched to prove they are real. "My place is small," Naledi said. "Very small. But it is dry." The old man looked at her then. Really looked. His face was lined like old bark, but his eyes were sharp, even in exhaustion. "You don't know us," he said. "No," Naledi answered, "but I know rain when I see it." Something changed in the old woman's face. A softness, a breaking. She pressed her hand over her mouth and nodded. The climb to the 5th floor nearly defeated them. The old woman, whose name Naledi later learned was Zola, had to stop twice to catch her breath. The old man, Mosi, pretended he was not tired, but his grip on the railing told the truth. Naledi climbed slowly beside them, worried every second that she had asked too much of her own body. By the time they reached her door, all three of them were breathing hard. When she switched on the light, the apartment looked even smaller than usual. For a moment, Naledi felt embarrassed by the damp walls, the cheap curtains, the rusted kettle. But Zola stepped inside and looked around as if she had entered a palace. "It's warm," she whispered, and tears slipped from her eyes. Naledi found towels. She boiled water. She made tea with the last of her sugar. Then she opened her cupboard and stared at the food she had been rationing for herself. Mealie meal, 1 onion, 2 packets of instant noodles, half a loaf of bread, and 3 eggs. Not enough for tomorrow. Certainly not enough for guests. She cooked it anyway. The three of them sat around the little table, eating slowly while rain battered the window. Zola held her cup with both hands. Mosi kept glancing at Naledi with an unreadable expression. Not suspicion exactly, and not gratitude alone. More like someone trying to understand how goodness still existed in a world that had already used up its share. Naledi spread extra blankets on the floor for them and lay awake long after they had gone still. She could hear the old woman's soft coughing. She could hear Mosi turning from side to side, never fully surrendering to sleep. She could feel the baby move once in the darkness. Everything in her life had been balanced on the edge of collapse already. Yet, strangely, with 2 strangers in her home, the room felt less empty than it had in months. The next morning, she woke to the smell of brewed coffee and onions frying in a pan. Naledi sat up, confused. For a moment, she thought she was back in the old days, before death and debt and silence moved in with her. Then she stepped into the kitchenette and froze. Zola stood at the stove, wearing Naledi's old apron over her clothes, humming under her breath as she stirred pap in a pot. On the counter sat a plate of fried onion and tomato. Mosi was crouched beneath the sink, with a screwdriver and a worn rubber washer in his hand. Naledi blinked. "What are you doing?" Mosi emerged slowly, wiped his hands on a cloth, and turned on the tap. Water came out. It stopped cleanly when he closed it. "The washer was finished," he said. "It bothered me." Naledi stared at the dry tap as if it were magic. For months, she had fallen asleep to that relentless dripping. She had stopped hearing it consciously, the way people stop hearing their own suffering when it lasts long enough. Now the silence was almost holy. Zola smiled at her. "Sit. You were carrying a child, not bricks." Naledi sat because there was something in Zola's voice that made refusal feel childish. Breakfast was simple, but it tasted like care, and care has its own flavor. She found herself eating more than she had in days. Zola watched without comment, though her eyes noticed everything. The shadows under Naledi's eyes, the swelling in her feet, the way she pressed one hand to her ribs when the baby kicked. For the next few days, the apartment changed without Naledi understanding how. Mosi repaired the loose window latch, straightened the cupboard door, and somehow fixed the bedroom light that had been flickering for weeks. Zola scrubbed the floor, aired out blankets, washed curtains by hand, and turned Naledi's cramped kitchen into a place where a person might imagine staying alive. In the evenings, Naledi came home to warm food, to conversation, to someone asking whether her back hurt or whether the baby had been active. She had not realized how badly she missed being waited for. On the fourth evening, Zola touched Naledi's ankle and frowned. "These feet are too swollen." Naledi tried to smile. "It's normal." "Some swelling is normal," Zola said softly. "This is not all normal. When is your next clinic visit?" Naledi busied herself removing her shoes. "Next week." "Will you go?" Naledi did not answer. Mosi looked up from the chair where he was mending a cracked stool leg. He said nothing, but his eyes moved from Naledi's face to the empty shelf where medication might have been. In that silence, Zola understood the real answer. That night she brought Naledi a bowl of soft porridge and sat beside her while she ate. She did not preach. She did not ask for explanations. She simply stayed. Far above the city, in a glass-walled office with a view stretching across Johannesburg, Tariq Okoye replayed security footage on a wide monitor. He was 34 years old, feared by businessmen, politicians, smugglers, and men who preferred not to be photographed. On paper, he owned logistics firms, real estate holdings, security companies, and a chain of exclusive clubs. Off paper, he controlled routes through the city that no one discussed in daylight. He had built his life on discipline, calculation, and the ability to look cold even when he was not. People called him many things. None of them were gentle. Yet on his screen, over and over, he watched a pregnant cleaner place herself between a shouting supervisor and an older woman too afraid to defend herself. There had been no performance in the way Naledi stood, no dramatics, no expectation of reward. She had simply decided that someone weaker should not be humiliated in front of her. Tariq leaned back in his chair, the city lights reflected in the glass behind him. "Find out who she is," he told the only man in the room with him. Kojo Mensah, his oldest and most trusted lieutenant, lifted one eyebrow. "The cleaner?" "Everything," Tariq said. "Name, address, family, situation." Kojo had long ago learned that when Tariq became this quiet, he was already serious. "All right," he said. "I'll get it." 3 days later, Kojo placed a slim file on Tariq's desk. "Naledi Dlamini," he said. 29. Widowed 3 months. Husband died in a construction accident. 7 months pregnant. Lives alone in a 5th-floor flat in Rosettenville. 2 months behind on rent. No parents on record. Grew up in institutions and foster homes. Night cleaner at Nhlabeni Towers. Tariq opened the file and saw a grainy photograph of Naledi in her work uniform. Hair tied back, eyes tired but steady. Kojo continued. "There's more. She recently brought 2 elderly people into her flat. Neighbors say they showed up with 1 bag and nowhere to go. No one knows who they are." Tariq's fingers stilled on the file. "Find out." Kojo nodded. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, a 52-year-old man named Kelechi Adeyemi sat in a rented room surrounded by overdue bills and empty bottles. He had spent the last 3 years falling one rung at a time. Bad investments, gambling debts, lies to cover other lies, then loans from men who treated repayment as a suggestion only, until it became a threat. 2 weeks earlier, desperate and ashamed, he had driven his parents to a bus station with $100, told them to wait while he found tickets, and never came back. He had done it telling himself he had no choice. That lie had lasted until the first night he drank himself to sleep, in the silence of the house he had taken from them. But shame does not always produce repentance. Sometimes it produces deeper cowardice. When the first threat came from the men he owed, Kelechi panicked. He began searching through an old trunk of his father's belongings for anything that might be sold. He found no cash, no jewels, only photographs, letters, and a brass pocket watch case with no watch inside. Then he found old papers with coded notations and names he half remembered from childhood murmurs. One name appeared several times: the Shade. He remembered his father drunkenly whispering it years ago, long after midnight, when regret had loosened his tongue. Kelechi had laughed then. He thought it was the fantasy of an aging man. But now, staring at photographs of his father standing beside dangerous-looking men at a dockside warehouse decades earlier, he began to wonder whether the stories had been true. If they were true, someone might pay for information. That idea would become its own kind of sin. One evening, after work, Naledi stopped at a small grocery store. She had a basket with rice, eggs, cabbage, cooking oil, and a tin of fortified milk powder Zola insisted she needed for the baby. At the till, she counted what was in her purse and knew before the cashier said the total that she was short. "Take the milk off," Naledi said quietly. The cashier nodded and reached for the tin. A man's hand appeared beside Naledi's, placing a note on the counter. "Keep it," he said. "Ring everything." Naledi turned. The man standing behind her was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal coat that looked more expensive than her month's rent. His face was composed in a way that suggested he had spent years teaching it not to give too much away. His eyes were dark, watchful, and strangely gentle for someone who wore power like a second skin. "I can pay for my own groceries," Naledi said, more sharply than she intended. "Not tonight," he answered. "I don't take money from strangers." "Then think of it as me losing an argument with a pregnant woman before it starts." The cashier, eager to avoid conflict, finished the transaction. Naledi took the bag reluctantly. "Thank you," she said. "But you shouldn't do this." "Probably not," he said. There was almost humor in that answer, and it unsettled her because she could not place him. He did not look like a man accustomed to casual kindness. He looked like a man people moved out of the way for. When she turned to leave, he added, "Walk carefully. The pavement outside is slippery." She looked back once. "Do I know you?" "No," he said, "but I know enough." Naledi carried the groceries home with his words lingering in her mind longer than they should have. She did not know that the same man would later instruct Kojo to pay her rent anonymously, or that Kojo, following other orders, was already tracing the history of the old couple living in her apartment. The truth surfaced piece by piece. Mosi Adeyemi had once been a feared enforcer in the Johannesburg underworld, known in whispers as the Shade, because he arrived without warning and disappeared without trace. 50 years earlier, he had worked for men who moved contraband through the rail yards and the old industrial districts. He had been young, ruthless, and very good at his work. Then, one night, he was sent to eliminate a man named Chinedu Okoye, who had become dangerous to the people Mosi served. Mosi found Chinedu in a warehouse, holding a small boy behind him. The boy could not have been more than 6. He stared at Mosi with frightened eyes, but did not cry. Something in that sight broke the machinery inside Mosi. He could no longer tell himself that violence was business, or survival, or fate. He spared Chinedu. He helped him escape, and in doing so, he vanished from the world that had named him the Shade. That small boy had grown up to become Tariq Okoye. Kojo learned all this from old police files, retired informants, and one former dock worker who still remembered the legend. When he placed a faded photograph on Tariq's desk, Tariq felt the world tilt in a way he had not allowed himself to feel since boyhood. The photograph showed his father as a young man, standing beside a taller figure with stern eyes and a scar over his brow. On the back, in his father's handwriting, were 5 words: "The man who let me live." Tariq sat very still. For years, his father had told him one unfinished story. That once, when death came close enough to smell, another man stepped aside and chose not to take what he had been ordered to take. Chinedu never said the name lightly. He kept an old watch in a velvet-lined box and said it belonged to the man who gave him a second life. Now Tariq knew where that man was. That same week, a violent storm rolled over Johannesburg after midnight. Wind rattled Naledi's window, and the electricity went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. Zola lit 2 candles. Their trembling flames threw long shadows across the walls. Naledi had always been afraid of thunder. Even as a child, she would cover her ears and press herself beneath thin blankets, imagining roofs lifting away, walls collapsing, the sky swallowing what little she had. That night, each crack of thunder made her flinch. Zola sat beside her and drew her close. Mosi stood by the window listening to the rain, as if it were speaking in a language he knew too well. After a long silence, he said, "Storms like this always bring the past back to me." Naledi looked up. The candlelight cut his face into planes of gold and shadow. Zola lowered her eyes. She knew what was coming. "I have not told you who I was," Mosi said. "A woman opens her home to old strangers and deserves at least the truth." Naledi said nothing. The storm itself seemed to fall quiet around his voice. "I did terrible work when I was a younger man. Work that paid well and poisoned the soul. Men feared me, and for a while I believed fear was as good as respect." He paused. "Then one night, I was sent to kill a father. I found him standing in front of his child. The child was looking at me the way a child looks at fire, knowing it is dangerous, not understanding why it exists." He turned toward Naledi. "I could not do it. I walked away from that life. I spent the next 50 years trying to become worthier than the man I had been." The candle trembled in a draft. Naledi listened without moving. "I became a carpenter," Mosi went on. "Built doors, windows, roofs, honest things. I raised my son, loved him the best way I knew. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, if I lived quietly enough, perhaps the old darkness would remain buried." His voice roughened. "But sometimes, a man escapes his past, only to be broken by his own blood." Zola's hand found his. He squeezed it once. Naledi rose, crossed the room, and sat beside him. "You are not what you were," she said. "You are what you chose after." Mosi looked at her with startled pain in his eyes, as if forgiveness had found him before he had finished asking for it. For the first time since entering her home, he wept openly. Zola leaned over his shoulder and held him. Thunder rolled outside, but inside that small apartment, something gentler took root. The kind of truth that makes strangers into family.
If you like this story, subscribe my channel for more beautiful stories. The next afternoon, Tariq climbed the 5 flights to Naledi's apartment himself. He carried a small wooden box in both hands. When Zola opened the door, surprise flashed across her face. Mosey came forward slowly, saw the man standing there, and went still. Even before a word was spoken, some deep old instinct stirred between the young man and the old. "You have your father's eyes," Mosey said. Tariq swallowed. "And you have the face from the photo he never stopped keeping." He entered the apartment, suddenly awkward in a room so modest it made his own world feel excessive. Naledi stood near the table, confused by the intensity of what she was witnessing. Tariq set the wooden box down and opened it.
Inside lay a silver watch, old but well preserved. "My father kept this until the day he died," Tariq said. "He told me if I ever found the man who spared him, I must return it." Mosey's hands shook as he lifted the watch. "I gave him this on the night I disappeared," he whispered. "I told him time is the most expensive thing a man can waste." Inside the lid, tiny engraved letters had faded but not vanished. "For Zola, every day is a gift." Zola covered her mouth and began to cry. Tariq stood watching them, a powerful man suddenly feeling like a child who had arrived late to a sacred meeting. "My father never forgot you," he said. "Not once." Mosey closed the watch and looked up. "Then he used his second life well?" A faint smile touched Tariq's mouth. "He tried. He raised me. He taught me to survive." The smile faded. "He just forgot to teach me softer things." The honesty of that sentence hung in the room. Naledi looked at Tariq differently then, not as the mysterious wealthy stranger from the grocery store, but as a man carrying invisible damage with expensive clothes wrapped around it. He turned to Mosey again and, to everyone's shock, went down on one knee. "Mfowettu," Mosey said, startled. "Get up." Tariq shook his head. "My father lived because of you. While you were sleeping rough in the rain, I was sleeping behind steel gates and armed security. I did not know. But I am ashamed that I did not know." Mosey bent down, gripped Tariq's shoulder, and raised him to his feet. "A debt repaid with respect is enough," he said. "Stand." Naledi would remember that moment long after. Not the kneeling itself, but the look on Tariq's face, like a man discovering humility was not weakness after all. But the past had not finished with Mosey. Kelechi, desperate for money, had already sold information about his father's survival to men connected to an old enemy network from the dock years. Once those men confirmed Mosey was alive, they decided a living ghost was worth more than a dead legend. They wanted him for what he knew, for old scores, for old pride. The reasons hardly mattered. Violence never needs only one reason. 3 nights later, Mosey woke before dawn with an old feeling crawling beneath his skin. A hunter's warning. He rose from the mattress on Naledi's floor and went to the window. In the alley below, headlights were off, but the shape of 3 vehicles sliding into place was enough. He counted figures stepping out. Too many. He woke Zola first, then Naledi. She came from her room with one hand over her stomach, eyes blurred with sleep. "What is it?" "My past," Mosey said. "And it didn't come alone." There was no time for softness. He handed Zola the phone Tariq had insisted they keep. "Call him." Zola dialed with shaking fingers. Tariq answered on the second ring. "They're here," Mosey said when the phone was passed to him. 10, maybe 12. "I'm coming," Tariq said, already moving before the line went dead. Heavy footsteps sounded on the stairwell. Mosey took his cane in hand and positioned himself near the door. Naledi stood behind him, refusing to retreat into the bedroom, though Zola pleaded with her to do so. The first kick hit the door like a hammer. The second split the frame. The third burst it open. Men rushed the entrance. Mosey did not step back. Old age had taken his speed, his strength, his certainty of victory. It had not taken his courage. He swung the cane into the first man's knee hard enough to drop him. Another grabbed for the bag near the wall, thinking Mosey might run. Mosey struck him across the face. Pain flared through his own shoulder, but he held the doorway long enough to make the attackers hesitate. Then the stairwell exploded with other footsteps. Tariq arrived with his security team like a storm of his own. Kojo was beside him. In the narrow hall, voices rose, men cursed, bodies shoved backward. Tariq stepped into the apartment with a gun in one hand and fury held under terrifying control. "You chose the wrong home," he said. The men had expected an old couple and a poor pregnant woman. They had not expected Tariq Okoye. In underworld mathematics, that changed everything. One by one they retreated, dragging their injured with them. No one fired. No one wanted to be the first to turn a rescue into a war with Tariq in a building full of witnesses. When the last of them disappeared down the stairs, Mosey lowered the cane, breathing hard. Naledi's whole body was trembling, but she was still standing. Tariq turned to her. "You're leaving tonight," he said. "All of you." "I'm not going anywhere I don't understand," Naledi said, voice unsteady but stubborn. "You can understand it later. Right now, I need you alive." She wanted to argue. Yet one look at the ruined doorway, the splintered wood, the fear in Zola's face, and even pride understood its limits. By sunrise, they were in one of Tariq's safe houses on the outskirts of the city, behind high walls and guarded gates. Naledi had never seen such space. The kitchen was larger than her whole flat. There was food in every cupboard, fresh linen, hot water that did not run out. A doctor arrived that afternoon to check her blood pressure and the baby's heartbeat. Zola almost cried at the sound of it. Naledi should have felt grateful, and she did, but gratitude was tangled with unease. Wealth this extreme had its own gravity. It pulled at people. It changed the way rooms felt. It made you aware of what you had never had. One Saturday evening, Tariq invited them to dinner at his penthouse in Santon. The apartment overlooked the city like a private kingdom. Glass walls, polished floors, expensive art. Silence that seemed designed by architects. Naledi stood by the window holding the railing of her own caution inside her chest. Mosi and Zola sat stiffly on a long cream sofa that looked too soft to trust. Tariq cooked himself to everyone's surprise. He chopped vegetables with efficient hands and asked Zola twice whether the stew needed more seasoning. Peace might have held if the lift doors had not opened. The woman who stepped out wore elegance like a weapon. Adana Okoye was beautiful in the sharp, expensive way that makes other people instinctively apologize for their own simplicity. Her perfume reached the room before her smile did. "So it's true," she said, glancing from Naledi to Mosi and Zola. "You've turned your home into a shelter." Tariq's jaw tightened. "Mother?" Naledi felt the temperature in the room change. Adana's eyes settled on Naledi's belly, on her plain dress, on the old couple seated behind her. "And this is the woman everyone is whispering about?" Naledi answered before fear could advise silence. My name is Naledi. Yes, Adana said coolly. I'm sure it is. The contempt in her gaze was not new to Naledi. She had seen versions of it in wealthy women at clinics, in school matrons, in the wives of church elders who donated blankets but never touched the people they were given to. Class has expressions older than language. I don't know what story you've heard about us, Naledi said. But we are guests here, not intruders. Adana laughed softly. Guests become burdens very quickly. Mosi rose before Tariq could speak. Madam, he said, his voice low but steady. 50 years ago, I saved your husband's life. The words landed like a dropped glass. Adana turned fully toward him for the first time. Mosi pulled back his sleeve to reveal the long scar running across his forearm. Your husband kept my watch until his death, Mosi continued. Your son returned it to me. So before you measure people by what they own, perhaps remember what was once owed. Zola stood as well, dignity straightening her age. And that young woman you are looking down on took us in when nobody else stopped. Wealth did not teach her compassion. Hunger did. Adana looked to Tariq, perhaps expecting him to restore the old order of her superiority. Instead, he met her gaze with a coldness so complete it stripped the room of air. You left when I was a boy, he said. You don't get to decide who belongs here. For one brief second, something cracked in her expression. Then it sealed again. She turned, entered the lift, and vanished the same way she had arrived, without apology, without warmth, without once looking back. Later that night, Naledi found Tariq alone on the balcony, staring at the city. You didn't have to defend us, she said. He did not turn. Yes, I did. You speak like a man used to command, not comfort. A sad smile touched his face. That is because command was the only language spoken in my house. She stood beside him in silence. The city glittered below, indifferent and alive. The next blow came from a different direction. Sibusiso Dlamini arrived at the safe house one morning in a cheap suit with a lawyer at his side and false confidence on his face. He had somehow learned where Naledi was staying. Men like him always learned where money might be. He placed legal papers on the table and smiled as if announcing good news. I filed for guardianship once the child is born, he said. A grieving widow with unstable housing, dangerous associates, and no blood family? A judge will listen. Naledi felt the room spin. You're insane, she said. No, Sibusiso answered. I'm practical. The compensation case for Themba's death is moving. There could be millions involved. That child is family. So am I. The truth, ugly and naked, stood in the room without shame. Mosi took one step toward him. You want your dead brother's child because you smell money. Sibusiso sneered. And who are you, old man? Some stray she collected? Before Mosi could answer, Tariq entered from the hallway with Kojo behind him. No, Tariq said quietly. He is someone under my protection, which is more than you will ever be. Sibusiso's confidence collapsed at once. He recognized Tariq. Kojo handed over a file. Tariq opened it and read in a calm voice that frightened more than shouting would have. Sibusiso Dlamini, gambling debt, complaint of domestic assault from former partner, outstanding tax issues, attempted insurance misrepresentation 2 years ago. Do you want me to continue? The lawyer beside Sibusiso quietly stepped backward.
You file one more paper against Naledi, Tariq said, and every court in this city will know exactly what kind of man is asking for custody. After Sibusiso fled, Naledi rounded on Tariq. You can't solve everything with fear. He looked at her for a long time. I know. That's not enough. No, he said again, more softly this time. It isn't. That night, Naledi packed a small bag.
Not because she had somewhere to go, but because fear can make movement feel wiser than stillness. This world around Tariq was too dangerous, too expensive, too sharp-edged. She did not want her child born into debts of violence and gratitude. Zola found her folding baby clothes with trembling hands. "Where will you go?" the old woman asked. "I don't know." "Then why are you leaving?" Naledi sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her fists to her eyes. "Because I don't know how to raise a child in a world like this. Because every time Tariq protects us, someone else comes. Because I am tired of danger finding me through other people's secrets." Zola came and sat beside her. "When I married Mosi, I was afraid of his past too. Not because he still lived in it, but because I feared it would come back." She took Naledi's hand. "A person's past matters. But what matters more is what they are willing to leave behind." Naledi whispered, "And if they can't leave it? Then you will know in time. But don't run before the truth has fully shown itself." Naledi's tears came then, heavy and unstoppable. "I don't know what family is supposed to feel like." Zola drew her into her arms. "It feels like being chosen again and again." The next evening, Naledi went to the rooftop terrace because she needed air bigger than the rooms inside her mind. Tariq found her there, hands gripping the railing, city lights stretched beneath them. "I heard you were packing," he said. "I was." "And now?" "Now I'm still thinking." He stood beside her, close enough to speak quietly, far enough not to trap her. "You were right about me." She said nothing. "I use power too easily. I reach for force because force built the world I know. My father taught me how to protect, but not how to soften. The men around me taught me how to win, not how to heal." He breathed out slowly. "But you make me hate the shape of the man I became." Naledi turned to him then. He held her gaze. "Not because you judge me. Because you don't. You look at me as if I could still be something else. Nobody has ever done that." The wind moved between them. "I am stepping away," he said, "from the operations that poison everything they touch. Kojo will dismantle what can be dismantled and hand the legal businesses over where they belong. I should have done it long ago. I didn't have a reason that was bigger than pride. Now I do." "Me?" Naledi asked, almost afraid of the answer. "You," he said. "And that child. And the two old people downstairs who remind me that a man can walk out of darkness before it finishes eating him." Naledi looked away toward the city. "Words are easy." "I know. So watch what I do." There was no grand promise after that, no sudden embrace. She simply placed her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around it with a tenderness that felt unfamiliar even to him. A week later, before dawn, Naledi's labor began. The first pain stole her breath. The second bent her forward. By the time the doctor arrived, the whole house was awake. Zola stayed with Naledi, wiping her face, counting breaths, whispering steady words. Mozi paced the corridor with Tariq, who wore a path into the floorboards by sheer force of anxiety. "I can face armed men without shaking," Tariq muttered once. "But this—" Mosey almost smiled. "That means your heart is finally in the right place." The labor was long. Naledi cried out for her mother once before remembering she had no memory of one. Zola took her hand and said, "Then call me." Naledi did. More than once. By afternoon, a child's first cry tore through the room. The sound stopped Tariq where he stood. A boy. Small, furious, alive. When Zola opened the door and beckoned him in, Tariq entered as if stepping into holy ground. Naledi lay exhausted against the pillows, hair damp, eyes shining with the stunned softness of someone who has just crossed pain into wonder. In her arms lay the baby, wrapped in white. "Come," she whispered. Tariq approached slowly. He looked terrified. "I don't know how to hold him." "You learn by holding," Naledi said. She placed the baby in his arms, guiding his hands. The child opened his eyes briefly, dark, serious eyes, not yet focused on the world. Tariq stared down as if every wall inside him had just been breached in silence. "He's so small," he said. "Yes," Naledi answered. "And he's ours to protect." The baby had his father Themba's chin, Zola said later. Mosey thought he had Naledi's eyes. Tariq said nothing for a long while because his throat had closed around emotion too large for speech. Naledi named the child Sibusiso? No, never. She laughed weakly at the very thought. "His name is Letabo Themba Dlamini," she said at last. "Letabo, because after all this sorrow, he is joy." Tariq looked up. "May I love him as my own?" Naledi saw no calculation in his face, only fear and hope standing side by side. "Yes," she said, "if you understand what that means." "It means I stay," he answered. He kept that promise. Months passed. The compensation case from Themba's accident was settled. Tariq's lawyers made certain Naledi received every rand she was owed, and that Sibusiso never came near her again. Tariq reduced his public empire, sold what needed selling, exposed what needed exposing, and withdrew from the parts of his life that could not be purified. Enemies complained. Associates panicked. Kojo handled them with calm efficiency. For the first time in decades, Tariq slept without 3 phones beside his bed. Mosi and Zola moved from the safe house not into another guarded mansion, but into a project of their own making. With the settlement money, Tariq's resources, and the Ledi's insistence that compassion must become larger than one family, they bought an abandoned guest lodge on the edge of the city and rebuilt it into a home for elderly people who had been discarded, neglected, or quietly erased by their own children. Mosi supervised the carpenters. Zola chose curtains, blankets, and paint colors. Naledi organized records, meals, and clinic schedules with the practical competence of the nurse she never got to become in school, but somehow became in life. Tariq paid for solar power, security, renovations, staff, and a garden big enough for memory and rest. They named it Adeyemi House. The first resident arrived with only a suitcase and a blood pressure machine. Then another came with a bag of old clothes and nowhere else to be. Then a retired teacher whose sons lived overseas and sent money but never visited. Then a grandmother, abandoned at a hospital after a stroke. Room by room the place filled, not with charity, but with restored dignity. One evening, at the long dining table, Mosi looked around at the old men and women eating soup, arguing over football, and laughing at Zola's complaints about too much salt in the stew. Naledi sat nearby with baby Lethabo in her lap. Tariq carried extra bread to the table himself. Mosi cleared his throat. He was never a man of many speeches. "I lost my home once," he said. "Then a young woman with almost nothing opened her door to me. Today, this house stands because kindness refuses to stay small." There were tears at the table. Even Kojo looked away to hide the moisture in his eyes. Months later, Kelechi Adeyemi was arrested in connection with the attempted abduction plot and the sale of criminal intelligence. Tariq could have ruined him more thoroughly. Instead, when the case ended and Kelechi appeared broken enough to understand what he had become, Tariq brought him to Adeyemi House and left the final decision to Mosi and Zola. Kelechi entered thin, unshaven, and trembling. He knelt before his parents before anyone asked him to. "I am sorry," he said, but the words sounded too small for the damage done. Mosi studied him for a long time. "Do you remember the red bicycle I bought you when you turned 10? He asked. Kelechi blinked through tears. "Yes." "I worked 3 extra jobs for that bicycle. I carried cement by day and repaired roofs by night. When you saw it, you threw your arms around me and said I was the greatest father in the world." Mosi's voice roughened. "I lived on those words for years." Kelechi bowed his head lower. "What hurts me most," Mosi said, "is not that you stole, not even that you betrayed me. It is that somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing us as human." Zola stepped forward then, her own tears steady but unspectacular, the tears of a woman long past dramatics. "I forgive you, because if I don't, bitterness will poison what is left of my life," she said. "But forgiveness is not the same as trust." Kelechi wept like a child. Mosi placed one hand on his shoulder, then removed it. "If you want another chance, earn it with the life you live from here." No one embraced him. No miracle erased the past, but a door, though narrow, remained unclosed. A year after the night of rain, Naledi married Tariq in the garden behind Adeyemi House. It was not an extravagant wedding. There were no celebrity guests, no magazines, no helicopters, no diamond displays. The guests were the residents of the home, the staff who had become family, Kojo in a dark suit pretending not to cry, and a few people whose lives had been rearranged by mercy. White fabric was tied to the chairs. Zola wore a gold head wrap. Baby Lethabo, almost walking now, kept trying to crawl toward the flower petals. Naledi wore a simple white dress that did not hide where she had come from. Her hands shook as she stood before a mirror in a small room near the garden. "I wish I had parents to see this," she whispered. When the door opened, it was Mosi standing there. He wore a navy suit tailored to his still solid shoulders and held a single white rose. "I know I am not the man who brought you into this world," he said, "but if you will allow me, I would like to be the man who walks you into this next part of it." Naledi began to cry before he finished speaking. When he led her down the garden path, every resident of Adeyemi House rose to their feet. Some clapped, some cried. Some simply placed hands over hearts that had once believed they would die forgotten. Tariq stood waiting at the end of the aisle, and when he saw Naledi on Mosi's arm, all the carefully controlled strength left his face. He looked not powerful, but grateful. Mosi placed Naledi's hand in Tariq's. Love my daughter with action, not speeches, he said. Tariq nodded once. I will. His vows were plain, which made them truer. I cannot promise you a perfect man. I have made too many mistakes to insult you with perfection. But I promise that every day I will choose light where I once chose power. I will protect this family without becoming what once endangered it. I will stay. Naledi smiled through tears. And I promise, she said, that I will never make you earn love through fear. Home will be where we speak truth and remain. When they kissed, Lethabo let out a delighted shout so loud the whole garden erupted in laughter. Even Mosey laughed hard enough to wipe his eyes. 2 years later, Adeyemi House had expanded into 2 buildings and a broad vegetable garden. Mosey taught basic carpentry to teenage boys from the neighborhood who needed skill more than sermons. Zola ran the kitchen like a queen with a wooden spoon. Naledi completed community health training and began coordinating elder care for 3 nearby districts. Tariq funded the program quietly and spent most afternoons carrying his son on his shoulders through rows of sunflowers. Kojo married the school librarian who had once told him he looked too serious to be trusted, and everyone agreed she was good for him. Kelechi did not become a saint. Real life rarely offers such neat rewrites. But he returned. First for repairs, then for volunteer work, then for long, difficult silences beside his father on the workshop bench. Mosey never rushed forgiveness, and Kelechi never again demanded it. Some reconciliations are built the way damaged houses are rebuilt, beam by beam, with no guarantee except effort. On quiet evenings, Naledi sometimes sat on the porch with Zola while the old residents traded stories under the jacaranda trees. Children from the neighborhood ran in and out of the yard because Adeyemi House had become the kind of place where people felt safe enough to laugh loudly. Lethabo chased chickens. Tariq, barefoot in the grass, pretended not to let the boy catch him. Mosey watched them all with the expression of a man who had outlived his own expectations. Once, Naledi asked him, "When you first came to my apartment, did you know life could still become this?" Mosey looked toward the sunset. "No," he said. "I only knew your room was dry and your hands were kind. Sometimes that is enough beginning for a miracle." Naledi never forgot that answer, because in the end, she had not saved 2 old strangers on a rainy night. Not exactly. They had saved her too. They taught her what being mothered felt like. They gave her someone to cook for, wait for, worry for, belong to. Tariq did not rescue her as much as learn beside her. Together they built a home large enough to hold the abandoned parts of many lives.
People often think love enters with music and certainty. But sometimes it enters limping, soaked by rain, carrying one plastic bag and a history no one dares ask about. Sometimes family arrives tired, ashamed, and half-broken. Sometimes grace does not look grand at all. It looks like a woman who has every reason to close her door and opens it anyway. Years later, when Letabo was old enough to ask how everyone came to live together, Naledi would smile and tell him, "It started with a storm, a tiny apartment, and 2 old people the world had thrown away." And when he asked what happened next, Mosi would tap the silver watch in his pocket. Zola would laugh softly from the kitchen, and Tariq would answer, "Then we learn that the people you shelter may become the very people who teach you how to come home." If you like this story, subscribe my channel for more beautiful stories.